All right, I think I'm ready to go. Hello, Tarunabh.
Srishti, you may start now.
Hello, Srishti.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this inaugural debate organized by Project Constitutionalism in partnership with LiveLaw. Today, we're speaking about whether India should embrace the presidential system of government or stick with the parliamentary system. A brief introduction of Project Constitutionalism. This is an organization founded in 2019 with the aim of increasing constitutional engagement, protecting constitutional rights, and strengthening constitutional governance. You can find out more about our work in constitutionalism.in, our website. Now, one of the ways in which we increase constitutional engagement is to have conversations like today's conversation on how our polity is organized. And I read something that Professor Upendra Bakshi mentioned about how this debate about the presidential system is a cyclical debate. It keeps coming up whenever there's a supermajority government. And that to me really hammers in the importance of this conversation because we seem to have been grappling with it from the very beginning. There are other scholars who've talked about how this debate is an academic debate in view of the basic structure doctrine. And perhaps that's a conversation for another day. I want to give a brief overview of this event. Speaking for the motion today, we have Mr. Bhanu Dhamija. Mr. Dhamija is the founder, CMD of the Divya Himachal Media Group, and he's authored the book, Why India Needs the Presidential System, which is a HarperCollins 2015 publication. Speaking against the motion, we have Professor Tarunabh Khaitan. He's a professor of public law and legal theory at the University of Oxford, a professor of law at the University of Melbourne, and a globally recognized expert in discrimination law and comparative constitutional law. The speakers will present their case, followed by a rebuttal and a sur-rebuttal. The debate will be followed by concluding remarks and a moderated discussion. We welcome your questions in the Q&A box. Giving concluding remarks is an individual who needs no introduction. Dr. Shashi Tharoor is a third-term member of Parliament for Thiruvananthapuram, a best-selling author, and a former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, without any further ado, over to you, Mr. Dhamija. Mr. Dhamija?
I can't. Yes. Oh, go ahead. Okay.
Over to you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, I congratulate Project Constitutionalism and LiveLaw for organizing this important debate. And I welcome Dr. Tarunabh Khaitan, and I look forward to his views. And let me thank Dr. Tharoor for his inspired leadership on this issue. There's a long list of people who have said throughout our history that the parliamentary system is not suitable for our country. Let me start with Mahatma Gandhi. He once said that if India copies England, it is my firm conviction that she will be ruined. He wrote to the British Secretary of State that my whole being rebels against the idea that in a system called democratic, one man should have the unfettered power. Today, we can all relate with Gandhi's objections. There are many who have agreed with Gandhi and advised against the parliamentary system. They usually have two grounds. It over-centralized and it was unsuitable for India's diversity. It might surprise you that even the British said that their system was unsuited to Indian conditions. In 1933, a British parliamentary committee reviewed all the factors necessary for the parliamentary system to work and wrote that in India, none of these factors can be said to exist today. B.R. Ambedkar was also a fierce opponent of the parliamentary system. In a secret meeting in 1939, he told the British Viceroy that the parliamentary system would not do in India. Before he was made chairman of the drafting committee, he submitted a proposal to our Constituent Assembly to structure India along the lines of the US presidential system. He even proposed a similar name, United States of India. But after he was made chairman, Ambedkar adopted the Congress party's and Nehru's preference for the parliamentary system and became its leading advocate inside the assembly. But as many of you know, he bitterly denounced his work only 2 years later. In the Rajya Sabha, he said he would be willing to burn the Constitution because it serves no one. When a member asked him why he defended it inside the assembly, He responded, "We advocates defend many things. I was a hack. What I was asked to do, I did, much against my will." Ambedkar wasn't alone. The choice of the parliamentary system was decried by most luminaries engaged in the framing of our Constitution. That whole story is in my book, but very briefly, Nehru proposed a typical parliamentary system, but Patel wanted the chief executive to be directly elected. Rajendra Prasad called a joint meeting to resolve this discrepancy. In this meeting in June 1947, 36 of the most eminent men involved, Nehru, Patel, Ambedkar, K.M. Munshi, Aladi Krishnaswamy Iyer, Govind Vallabh Pant, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, all voted down the idea of a figurehead president and asked Nehru to reconsider. But this never happened. Patel's proposal that the governors be directly elected was approved by the assembly, but it was later reversed. It was the only major reversal inside our Constituent Assembly. Objections to the parliamentary system have continued to this day. Many experienced leaders have said that we should consider switching to the presidential system. Listen to some of their names: Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Inder Kumar Gujral, J.R.D. Tata, President Venkata Raman, Justices Venkatacharya and Bhagwati, Union Ministers L.K. Advani, Arun Shuri, Shashi Tharoor, Rajiv Pratap Rudy, Chief Ministers Babu Bhai Patel, Shanta Kumar, Ram Krishna Hegde, Supreme Court Advocate Nani Palkhiwala, commentators Khushwant Singh, Kuldeep Nayyar, and most recent to come out of the closet, Shivraj Patil. So what troubles these experienced leaders about the present system? Let me highlight 5 of its most fundamental flaws and show how the presidential system removes them. The first parliamentary flaw is its motion of majority rule. This principle allows the winner of an election to completely ignore the losers by not giving them any share in the executive power or lawmaking. Since parties usually come to power with a minority of votes, the BJP received only 38% in 2019. Our Constitution denies most people any say in governance for a long stretch of 5 years. What's worse is that in a Hindu majority nation, the principle of majority rule creates sectarian governments. They appease either the majority or the minority in order to gain power. The presidential system alleviates these problems of majority rule in many ways. First, it makes it harder for majorities to form by enlarging the election constituencies. The local officials are elected locally, but national officials, such as senators and the president, are chosen in statewide and nationwide elections. It is difficult to win such large elections on communal or caste basis. Second, the presidential system divides powers extensively, so interested majorities can do little harm. Powers of city, state, and national governments are strictly divided, unlike India's concept of concurrent powers. And lastly, that system avoids majority rule by giving minorities more say through its checks and balances. For example, the Senate's filibuster rule allows only 40% to deny a piece of legislation. What all this means is that even if a demagogue comes to power in that system, he cannot turn the whole nation into a majoritarian frenzy, because his role and powers will be limited. The parliamentary system's second fundamental flaw is its fusion of executive and legislative powers. Walter Badger, British constitutional scholar, wrote that this fusion is the precise principle of that system. But this is disastrous for a system of government. It eliminates any check on the executive or the legislative. When the survival of one depends on the other, who's going to check whom? They become cohorts in corruption. But that's not all. The combining of executive and legislative powers makes for bad laws. Because when the executive is guaranteed a majority in parliament, who's going to bother debating legislative proposals? This is why India's parliament has become what Shashi Tharoor has called a notice board. The presidential system separates powers by appointing each branch separately through direct elections. Since the survival of the president doesn't depend on Congress and vice versa, they're not fearful to check each other. Appointing them separately also allows them to be controlled by different parties. This notion of divided government exists only in the US system. It forces each party and each branch to fight for public approval. As American founding father James Madison said, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. This is why the US system is so rancorous. It is democracy at work. The parliamentary proponents say that the presidential system are dysfunctional. But let me address this in the next segment. The parliamentary system's third fundamental flaw, so-called strong center. It is inherently a unitary system. In India, what I call a federalism of convenience. The states have rights and freedoms only so long as they are sanctioned by the center. But this is devastating for a diverse society. It suffocates local expression of languages and cultures. We are so fearful of local people controlling their own affairs that we have made a mockery of democracy. The presidential system is rooted in local governments so that citizens can engage in self-governance. Let me give you an example. A town's mayor and council are directly elected. So if the population is predominantly Korean, the town can have a Korean American mayor, have Korean language taught in schools, or posted on street signs, so long as this doesn't break any state or national laws. Every state has ratified the US Constitution, so there is no fear of secession, nor is there any provision. The fourth major flaw of the parliamentary system is its handling of political parties and elections. Our Constitution gives powers to parties, but does nothing to regulate them. The only regulations came with the anti-defection laws, which made the centralization of power even worse. Now the party bosses have carte blanche, and MPs and MLAs have become bondsmen, in the words of A.G. Noorani. The party bosses choose candidates who are loyal to them personally, and they make secret deals to form or break governments. The president deals with parties and elections entirely differently. Since these elections are conducted by the states themselves, the parties become decentralized, allowing local leaders to control their own affairs. But the national presidential election pushes regional parties to join the national parties. This delivers control and national unity. Also in that system, the candidates are chosen in open primaries, not by party bosses. This not only restricts a party-state nexus, but avoids political dynasties. The last fundamental flaw of our parliamentary system I have time to discuss today is its unaccountable judiciary. We have a court system that is entirely aloof from the elective branches. It has no accountability to the people. The judges are appointing themselves and routinely overreaching with impunity. This lack of public accountability has caused delays in delivering justice and corruption. Our vast number of pending cases makes us one of the worst performing judiciaries in the world. The presidential system remedies this problem in three ways. Its judiciary is decentralized as the states run their own. This provides efficiency and local accountability. Second, the US Congress is authorized to create additional courts as necessary. This makes people's representatives accountable for the system of justice. And lastly, under that system, judges are appointed jointly by the president and the Senate, giving people a say. The process is politicized, but in a democracy, there is no alternative. The people must have a say. All these differences give the presidential system one overarching benefit. It offers the best protection against one-man rule. There is a myth that the presidential system is authoritarian. The situation is just the opposite. It is our present system which creates the autocrats. Before I close, let me say three more sentences. I'm a proponent only of the US system and not its variations like France, since they alter the balance of power. I'm an advocate of the US system, not an apologist for all US decisions, including that of Trump, but we can discuss him later. I believe firmly that there is nothing lacking in the Indian people. It's our Constitution that is at fault. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dhamija, for that riveting opening statement, and over to Professor Khaitan for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Srishti and Abhishek, for organizing this excellent debate. Now, Mr. Dhamija, my honorable opponent, as well as our concluding speaker today, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, have long advocated a presidential system. And pitting two against one, I think even Gabbar Singh would agree, bahut nainsafi hai. So I do take some solace in the fact that Dr. Tharoor, who lent his authority as a parliamentarian to my anti-discrimination bill, will surely not discriminate in his concluding speech. So let me begin by just pointing out the clarification came at the end of Mr. Dhamija's opening remarks, and I think that's an important one to emphasize. He's not defending a presidential system. He's defending the American system. And that's important because I actually agree with a lot of his criticisms against the Indian system we currently have. There are flaws in our constitution, but not all of them are intrinsic to a parliamentary model. And I will say which of his criticisms actually bite a parliamentary system and which of them don't. But so let's start by first being clear about what is the feature of the two systems. What is presidentialism and what is parliamentarism at its core? So in a parliamentary system, the core most essential feature of a parliamentary system is that the dominant legislative chamber in India, the Lok Sabha, has the power to hire and fire the prime minister at will. So it does not need to give any reasons. There is no proceeding like an impeachment. There is no trial. There is no hearing. You hire at will, you fire at will, at least in the ideal form of the system. Right? If a premier loses confidence of the House, she must resign. In a presidential system, as Mr. Dhamija told us rightly, the people elect a president and a legislature separately and directly, so that the president remains in office even if she does not enjoy the confidence of any legislative chamber. These is the only distinguishing mark of the two systems. A lot of the other features that Mr. Dhamija talked about are compatible with both systems, and whether that be strong or weak federalism. Australia is a parliamentary system with an extremely strong form of federalism, so is Canada. Independent or partisan judiciary. In fact, if there's one thing that all scholars, including especially American scholars, agree on, which is that the American Supreme Court is not an independent court, it is a deeply partisan court, right? So both weak and partisan judiciaries are compatible with presidential and parliamentary systems. So are independent institutions like election commission. So on a lot of comments like decentralization, on federalism, etc., I actually agree with Mr. Dhamija, but I believe that there's space for all of those things within the Indian constitution. And of course, the governors is a design flaw in our system. They have to go. But again, that's not necessitating a move to a presidential model. We can just have a parliamentary system as chief ministers elected with the investiture vote that many other systems use without a governor. So let me come to my main point, which is this. When you go to buy a house that a builder has promised to build for you, right? The builders often have a show house, which is, ye aake dekh lijiye, aisa hum banate hain, theek hai? A wise buyer will insist on seeing a few other houses built by that builder before committing to contracting with that builder, right? And the trouble is that Mr. Dhamija has only looked at the United States as a model of presidential system. So he rightly says that a president within the system is normally politically weaker than the prime minister. That is not the worry that Democrats have about the presidential system. The worry is this. So allow me to show you some of the other houses other than the show house, which is the US, for the presidential model, because the US model has been extremely popular. India is not the first country that is actually thinking about adopting it. Umpteen number of democracies around the world have been influenced by the American model, have adopted it, especially in Latin America, especially across Africa, and even our Sri Lankan neighbors are currently debating a bill, the 20th Amendment, to move towards a presidential model. Let's see what their experience has been, right? So I'm quoting a 3-decade-long political science scholarship on the relationship between presidentialism and democratic fragility. So Chaibab, he's actually a proponent of the presidential model, notes that there is only one long-lived democracy that is also presidential, which is the United States. Now, survey after survey has shown that extremely sturdy, strong, and stable statistical correlation exists between presidential form of government and democratic fragility. And this is even after statisticians have controlled for all types of variables. And I'll just give you one sample, the expected, and this is again an extremely well-known study, but it's basically 3 decades of scholarship when scholars have tried to disprove the statistical data, and nobody has managed to do it, right? And the sample statistic is this: the expected life of a parliamentary democracy between 1946 and 2002, this is, I'm quoting from a study in 2005 or 6, was 58 years. That of a presidential democracy was only 24 years, right? So this is absolutely representative of what the statisticians have found. The only debate in this literature over 3 decades is this: not whether this correlation exists. The only debate is whether presidentialism causes democratic fragility, or whether presidential regimes whether already fragile democracies are more likely to adopt presidentialism. That is the only debate in the literature, right? So when we only focus at the show house, the exception that is the United States, and do not look at basically every other democracy from Brazil to Sri Lanka, we are putting a lot of faith in the hope that we will also be standing with that exception and not what has actually been the norm with presidentialism. And this is all sorts of different tweaks have been tried, including borrowing an American size system per se. So why is it the case? Why it is counterintuitive, and I agree with Mr. Dhamija, it is counterintuitive because it doesn't make sense that a leader, when the leader has so many checks, or what in the literature is called veto players, right? A prime minister has very few veto players. In a bicameral legislature, the Rajya Sabha is a veto player against the prime minister's will until the prime minister's party does not have a majority in the Rajya Sabha. Other than that, perhaps the Supreme Court in some jurisdictions, not others, right? But there are very few veto players in a parliamentary system. In a strong federal system, perhaps the federal states will be a veto players. In a presidential system, there are many more veto players. Why are presidential regimes so liable then to democratic failure, right? I will answer that question before I point out another fact, which is this: that almost every autocratic leader in a democracy has wanted to switch from a parliamentary model to a presidential one. Whether it's Erdogan in Turkey, whether it's Rajapaksa in Sri Lanka, or whether it was Indira Gandhi in India. There is no known autocrat who has wanted to turn a parliamentary system into a presidential system while staying in power. What do these autocrats know that we don't know? Why are they so keen to adopt a system that will supposedly reduce their powers? Here is the answer. The first is that a presidential system concentrates power in an individual rather than a ruling party. This is a common, and Mr. Dhamija sort of agreed with this, that parliamentary systems make parties very strong and party bosses very strong, right? So if you are an ambitious individual in a democratic system, you would rather have an institution personally controlled, albeit with lesser institutional power, than have greater institutional power but less personal power, because more controlled by the party, right? So what is the bug in the parliamentary system, which is that sometimes prime ministers behave like presidents, is a feature of presidentialism, which is individualizing core executive power, right? This does not, of course, explain the fragility of the system, but this is the basic premise of the next step. And before I move to the next step, notice a distinction between fragility of governments and fragility of regimes. Now, again, here there is a vast consensus in political science and political literature that while parliamentary regimes do create fragile governments, presidential systems create fragile regimes. So when we look at regime turnover, when a regime moves from a democracy to an authoritarian system, that happens a lot more frequently in presidential systems rather than in parliamentary systems. Why is that? Here is the second premise. Once a system individualizes executive power and makes parties extremely weak, then two things can happen. Either the president, the individual president, her party happens to control the legislature, in which case she will govern without any checks until the end of her tenure, and in fact is much stronger than a prime minister. So this is times of united government in a presidential system. Alternatively, her party is in a minority in the legislature, in which case her democratic mandate will be frustrated and she will claim that it is frustrated. by the parliamentary opposition during legislation. And what this means is that a presidential system creates incentives for strong leaders to work against the system, to undermine the system. And that is why presidential systems, although the governments are more stable because the tenure is fixed, tend to be regime unstable. And I think we really have to take the data seriously if we are to argue for a presidential system move. My time is up, so I will stop here and maybe come back on my in the reply phase. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And now, Dr. Dhamija, for your rebuttal. Over to you.
Well, I'm only a Mr. Dhamija, not a Dr. Dhamija in any case, but thank you. Well, Dr. Khaitan's view, if I understood it properly, is that presidential systems, when copied in other countries, have failed. I don't disagree with that at all. And there's a long history of why they have failed and how they were adopted, and Turkey is a good example to study. Which is why I have said in my opening remarks that I am only in favor of the US presidential system. All others have altered the balance of powers in some way, and each has to be studied separately to know what went wrong. But as far as the US system is concerned, in 233 years, no US president has ever been able to act autocratically. In recent years, we have seen how that system cut President Trump down to size. Every time he tried to overreach, he was stopped by a state government or by Congress or a court or even by his own departments. Within 2 years of coming to office, his powers were drastically cut by the 2018 midterm election. The opposition party launched tons of investigations against this president. A single statement he made in a telephone conversation with the president of Ukraine led to the man's impeachment. Such checks just don't exist in any other system of government in the world. And these checks are structural, built into the Constitution. And unlike our prime minister, a US president cannot change the Constitution. He cannot make laws or enter treaties with foreign governments, draw funds from the treasury, or even appoint his own cabinet without approval. America's defense forces do not report only to him. The defense secretary is appointed jointly by the president and the Senate, and Congress controls military budgets. So it is nothing but a myth that autocrats favor the US presidential system. It's not the US presidential system that they adopt. They make a variation that suits them, which is exactly what de Gaulle did in France. When he wanted to adopt the presidential system, he realized that it was much easier for him to consolidate powers under his existing parliamentary system, so he stayed with it. This is the same story here in India. Indira Gandhi wanted to adopt this system back in the days of emergency, but dropped the idea because she realized that it was much easier to consolidate powers under the Indian parliamentary system. Trump is a good example to look at how that system deals with autocrats. He's widely disliked, but that doesn't make their system bad. Would the presidential system be acceptable to us when Obama was president, or Reagan was president, or Kennedy was president? Because it's the same system today. Trump is a demagogue, but he was elected because nearly 50% of the Americans thought he was a good bet. He won fair and square with the electoral college system. He paid more attention to certain swing states and switched them to his party. The man is a political novice running against 10 governors, 5 senators, and a world-famous opponent. But he won because people liked his anti-elitism, focus on jobs, trade, and economy, and so on. But as we know, he's an unprincipled, pompous ass who pretends to know everything. But every time Trump overreaches, he is slammed by the US system. Today, it looks like he will remain a one-term president. I'm speaking on this because I know it's on people's mind that, what about Trump? He's going to remain a one-term president. His powers were cut drastically within 2 years. In 4 years, he'll be out of the office. Dr. Khaitan has written himself how Modi is aggrandized himself and how our democracy is in peril under him due to a party-state nexus. Dr. Khaitan has written that Modi is killing our constitution with 1,000 cuts. In the US, Trump lost most of his powers within 2 years. He will likely be thrown out. Under our system, Modi has won re-election and has consolidated more and more powers. So I don't see the charge that the presidential system is autocratic stick. And I agree with Dr. Khaitan that it is not a variation of the US presidential system that we ought to look at. Only the US presidential system, only the original, and keep the balance of powers it has to offer. As you might know, there is also a big debate going on in the United States about whether they should reform their system. And one of the professors at University of Virginia wrote a book outlining some 24 different reform proposals for the US presidential system, but none of them changes the basic structure of that constitution. As long as we stick with the basic structure of that constitution, I don't think there is any reason to feel that it is prone to autocracy. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dhamija. Over to Professor Khaitan for his rebuttal.
Thank you very much, Srishti. So first, the empirical evidence that I cited is not one that relates to semi-presidential system, which Mr. Dhamija rightly say is a different type of system. But anyway, let's put that to one side, although I do think that a lot of these countries did adopt the US system pretty similar. And by the way, there's a lot of debate within the US, right? So Professor Bruce Ackerman of Yale University has, in a path-defining paper, The New Separation of Powers in 2000, heavily criticized the American presidential system and says no country should adopt it and we should get rid of it. But here is what the presidential system does, even when it, so let me clarify first my argument. My initial argument was that presidential systems incentivize anti-democratic moves on the Constitution. So it incentivizes anti-system moves, but apart from that argument, even when it's working as it is supposed to work, here is what happens. The first is that the American constitutional model is normatively one of a minimalist libertarian state. And this is an inevitable consequence of the number of veto players that the American system puts in place. Right? So you have a system which is designed for government not to function, which is in favor of the status quo. So remember the cost of that system, the price we will have to pay for that system is that all the egalitarian and transformative goals under the Indian Constitution, which require a strong state, will be unachievable. So this is ideology that becomes embedded in the Constitution. So the second is that the winner-take-all worry that Mr. Dhamija points out. This is, jiski lathi usi ki bhens problem, right? In a closely contested presidential system, when the president wins extremely narrowly, the system comes under a huge stress. And this is something we're going to see at the end of 2020 in the United States, if it happens to Trump, right? If the difference between Trump and Biden is extremely narrow. Now, the US has been there before, right? Remember 2000, Al Gore and George W. Bush. Bush wins because of a Supreme Court vote, not on the Democratic vote, but the system is saved because the loser is not a sore loser, right? The loser is prepared to play by the rules. Al Gore concedes and bows out. When Trump loses narrowly in 2020, he's not going to bow out. And that is the problem with thin majorities in a presidential system. Parliamentary systems will create fragile governments, hung houses. There will be movements. So governments will be fragile, but the instability is internalized within the system, so that you don't have any systemic challenges to the legitimacy of democracy itself. When you have extremely close winners and losers, I take the point about winner take all. We have a long way to go in recognizing opposition rights, but they're very strong in many parliamentary democracies and much stronger than the US. The judicial appointment system in the US, Trump changed the Constitutional Convention by himself without any change in the law. From 60 senators to 50 senators, he can appoint Supreme Court judges. That happened in the first Trump regime, right? Because it was not a written constitutional rule. It was a constitutional conventional rule. Now, Republicans have instituted The final argument against the presidential system, given the nature of the system, because it's vested in one individual, you have to have term limits, right? The problem is that the final term of any president has no electoral accountability to it. In the final term, the president knows that he or she is not going to face the electorate at all, is free to do whatever they want, right? So I'll end on a final thought, which is this. A lot of the problems that Mr. Dhamija points out, I've already mentioned governors, I've already considered governors need to go, I've already considered that the anti-defection law needs to be made a lot more robust. The holes need to be fixed, needs to be applied only to confidence vote and not to everything under the sun. But here is an idea that is possible in India with merely a statutory change, without a constitutional change, which is going to result in a lot of the safeguards that Mr. Dhamija and I are extremely aware of. And I absolutely agree about the fear of authoritarianism under Prime Minister Modi, which is a move from first past the post system, not to proportionate vote, which is what people usually seek and demand, but an alternative vote model, which is a preferential vote model. You can call it a 1, 2, 3 ranking system, right? Where each voter has the right to rank their top 3 candidates, give them 1, 2, or 3 rank. This is a system used in Australia. Well, this is a modified version of that system, but in a lot of other democracies. What does this do? I'll just take a minute to explain what it does. It counts not just every voter's head count, but it counts the intensity of their preference. So parties are forced not just to appeal to their base, because parties can only win elections if they get sufficient number 2 votes, sufficient second choice votes, right? Because so you have rounds of exclusion, and a party, if no party gets 50% on the choice 1 vote, second round is counted. It keeps going until one candidate gets 50% vote, right? What it does is it forces parties to speak to a broad coalition, which is not a tiny plurality that wins 31, 35, 36% that Mr. Dhamija rightly worries leads to a polarized majoritarian anti-minority system. And an alternative vote system can bring politics closer to the median voter in our society, sort of the voter who is in the middle of the ideological spectrum, will force parties to speak to voters, not only to vote for them, but to force parties to speak to voters to say, if you don't like us, can you at least tolerate us by giving us a second vote? So that is a system in which a party like the BJP, I don't think will flourish at all. It'll have to change to become a big tent rather than a polarized party. I'll end on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And I think one thing that we can see from our conversation is we know something ails our system, and we all want to look for a way forward. And to that end, I would request Dr. Shashi Tharoor to give his concluding remarks on this subject. You're on mute, sir.
Apologies, am I unmuted now? Thank you very much, Srishti, and it really has been a pleasure listening to 2 such fine intellects engage with each other on an important question. And I have to concede Tarunabh's point that there is a certain nainsafi about 2 of us who've nailed our colors to the presidential mast, taking him on. But Tarunabh, if it's any consolation, it is always easier to defend the status quo than to challenge it. So I think that those of us who are coming back to this, I think will seek to be excused in order to keep this debate going. And you may find some consolation when I find the end. Now, the point I really wanted to latch onto was your interesting analogy that anyone buying a house would need to look at several other houses of the same type, and that's not encouraging for advocates of a presidential system. But if I can continue with your metaphor, those of us who are already living in a house that we've already bought and can see the problems with the structure of that house can be forgiven for looking for a totally different type of house. And that's really where I come from. I suspect that may be true of Bhanu as well, but I'll let him speak for himself. In my case, it's really a question of relating the parliamentary system as we know it and the way in which it has operated for 72 years, rather than any theoretical model of the parliamentary system. Because in fact, the disgraceful political shenanigans of the nation has been witnessing for some time. And most recently, we've seen it in Karnataka, in Madhya Pradesh, in Rajasthan, horse trading of MLAs to switch allegiances for power and pelf. I mean, these are a usual occasion for breastbeating about morality in politics. Maybe there'll be comments about the opportunism of the cash-rich ruling party. But behaving in this way, we know our politicians are violating every canon of legislative propriety, and yet we never seem to look beyond their behavior to the reason why that behavior is enabled, which is the system that makes it possible. And so my argument has always been premised on the assumption that the parliamentary system we borrowed from the British has not worked in Indian conditions. And that's where I agree with Bhanu Dhamija about the US presidential model, because it seems to me to incorporate not just all the safeguards that he's talked about that I believe would be very necessary in our system and in our country, but it actually also seems to require political behavior that is much more in conformity with the demonstrated political behavior of the average Indian voter and the average member of the Indian public. Now let me take one step back, since I've been asked to speak 15 minutes, and look at the larger arguments against, to summarize my own thinking on this, which, as you said rightly, I have published in various places. The concern remains that our parliamentary system has created legislators who are largely unqualified to legislate, who seek election only in order to wield or influence executive power. And as a result, we have governments dependent on a fickle legislative majority who spend much of their time and energy focused on politics, the politics of their own survival, rather than on policy or performance. And at the same time, it does so in a country where the voters have repeatedly demonstrated that they like to vote for individuals rather than parties. They don't really follow the political agendas of parties, the manifestos of parties. In fact, in many cases, I'm not sure there's a great deal to be said between the political convictions of many of the parties, with the stark exceptions of the BJP on one side and the communists on the other. Almost all the other parties, including the regional parties, essentially are variations of the same sort of social democratic consensus that has dominated Indian parliamentarianism since the 40s. And at the same time, we are in a situation where it seems to me the current manner of operation of our democracy has become a source of our major weakness in this democracy. And I know that to suggest this is political sacrilege. In fact, I was glad that Bhanu mentioned the UK Parliamentary Committee in 1933, that actually pronounced itself on the unsuitability of the parliamentary system for Indian conditions as far back as 87 years ago. But of course, what the Brits didn't realize is that that will immediately make Indian nationalists suspicious of British intentions. Because, after all, like the American revolutionaries 2 centuries ago, Indian nationalists were fighting for the rights of Englishmen, which they thought the British were determined to deny them. So when the Brits said parliamentary system won't work in India, they said, my gosh, it had better work because, clearly the British want to deny us something because it's good for us. So they thought the replication of the Houses of Parliament would both reflect the rights of Englishmen and guarantee them to Indians. In fact, Clement Attlee, the former British Prime Minister, was a member of a British Constitutional Commission, and he wrote that when he suggested the US presidential system as a model to Indian leaders, he recalled they rejected it with great emphasis. Actual quote, I had the feeling that they thought I was offering them margarine instead of butter. So that was the problem. We really thought the Brits want to deny us the good things. They want to keep them for themselves. And so let's go ahead and take what the Brits have been depriving us of. And this is an entirely understandable approach for an entire generation or a political establishment that is suffering exclusion. But at the same time, we have to understand that the parliamentary system devised in Britain, which is a small island nation, it was conceived when electorates were initially of a few thousand voters per MP. Even today, less than 1 lakh per constituency. It assumes a number of conditions which simply don't exist in India. Requires clearly defined political parties with a coherent set of policies and preferences, each distinguishing it from the next. Whereas in India, a party is all too often a label of convenience, which a politician adopts and discards as frequently as a Bollywood film star changes costume. And let's face it, very often the parties are emanations of a particular identity, and headed by leaders who essentially cannot be changed. And this is true of the vast majority of India's political parties. They're all fuzzily vague about their beliefs. And as we saw with the tragic passing of Raghuvansh Prasad Singh yesterday, even the question of which party they give allegiance to can change right up to the very last minute, often on a day-to-day basis. And we've seen, I mean, I won't name the individual, but we have in our midst a politician, former union minister, who has actually been a member of 7 different parties in the course of the last 15 years. So you're talking about a system where the entire logic of the party system that underpins British parliamentarianism essentially doesn't exist in India. Our voters vote for individuals. If they want a Narendra Modi as a prime minister, or a Mamata Banerjee or a Jagan Mohan Reddy as their chief minister, they have internalized the idea they must vote for somebody else as their MP or their MLA in order to indirectly accomplish that result. Now, this is a perversity that only the British could have devised. To vote for a legislation, not to legislate, but in order to form the executive. It's really the classic Indian thing about catching your nose from the back of your head. I mean, that's essentially what we're expecting people to do. And so this creates all sorts of problems. I won't belabor them because you know about them all. It limits executive posts to those who are electable rather than those who are able. The prime minister cannot appoint a cabinet of his choice. In fact, Modi, who likes to do that, has brought in an extraordinarily large proportion of his ministers through the Rajya Sabha. But that's not the logic. In any case, most of the Rajya Sabha is still the preserve of full-time politicians. So the talent pool has not exactly been significantly widened. Then second, it puts a premium on defections and horse trading. Tarunabh wants to tighten the anti-defection law. But in fact, the problem is the anti-defection law has actually turned out in practice to curtail the freedom of independent-minded legislators to express themselves. Legislation itself suffers because the laws are drafted by the executive, in practice by the bureaucracy, and parliamentary input into their formulation and passage is minimal. Many bills pass after barely 15 minutes of debate. We just saw one today. 2 bills are passed in a collective 15 minutes of debate today. So the problem we have in these situations is the parliamentary system of India does not permit the existence of a legislature distinct from the executive, applying its collective mind freely and holding the government accountable to the people. And finally, of course, because once you have a parliamentary majority, you realize the outcome of all votes, a foregone conclusion, all debates are utterly, at the end of the day, just for the record. I speak because I as an amateur historian, I'm still fond of preserving the record that we did say the right thing even if we never got our way. The fact is, Parliament is not a solemn deliberative body as it is in Britain, but as a theatre for I mean, I call it a notice board, as Bhanu quoted me as saying. And on the other side, from the opposition, it's often a theatre for their power to disrupt. And this essentially is to show the strength of their feelings by disrupting the lawmaking rather than debating the law itself, because the debate, ultimately, many of them feel is futile. Now, this is the reason why we don't like the house that we have built for ourselves in the last 72 years. Now, Tarunabh very graciously talks about various reforms. One of the reasons that he says that the presidential system is bad is that it creates fragile regimes. But I would argue that what we have been seeing for the last 6 years is a system which is deliberately promoting its own fragility by undermining all the constitutional checks and balances, from the judiciary to independent institutions of various sorts, to Parliament itself, even to the free press. So ultimately, you have something far worse than any presidential system can give you, because every decision can be sanctified by a rubber stamp majority in the legislature. And therefore, the government can absolutely point to the trappings of democracy by having every one of its decisions ratified by its own in-house claque, while instead a presidential system would have had an independent legislature and put the onus on the president to form his own support bases on each different issue with different parties. Now, I think I may be running out of time, so I better wrap up. On the question of the US system versus other presidential models, I join Bhanu in suggesting the US system. And one of the reasons I do so now is because I see a very major train wreck looming in the Indian parliamentary system. When the constitutional amendment, which freezes parliamentary seat allocations with the census of 1971, lapses in 2026, and it's very clear that the majoritarian BJP of Mr. Modi will not renew that. So you're suddenly going to find a major expansion of seats in the overpopulated Hindi heartland, which will be supportive of the BJP, and a de facto disenfranchisement of the non-Hindi speaking states who will no longer have a critical mass in parliament to be able to have a significant impact, including when it comes to votes of confidence and so on. And at the end of the time, this parliamentary change, which is understandable, defensible on the grounds of if one man, one vote has to have any value, then surely the vote of let's say, a Kerala voter should not be able to elect more MPs than the same vote of a UP voter. And I understand the logic of that. But if you want to care for Indian unity, as I do, you do need a system. And in the US presidential system, you would be able to borrow the idea of the electoral college to ensure that a future president cannot be elected without seeking support in other states as well, and having, therefore, a check and balance built into the electoral system too. Let me then conclude. There's a lot more to be said, but I think we should respect the time limits that you two have respected by saying that as far as the reforms that Tarunabh says are needed in the parliamentary system, the elimination of governors, the reforms in the anti-defection law, and the alternative preference vote are concerned, I will make him happy and Bhanu unhappy by saying that that combination of reforms may actually be easier to sell to the present political establishment than what Bhanu and I are advocating. Very simply, the political establishment knows the system that it's currently operating or manipulating or working within, whatever phrase you want, and therefore they will be and are incredibly resistant to changing it. And of course, some have also arguments of principle, like Tarunabh. Many of my own colleagues in the Congress party say that the parliamentary system is the one check they've got to be able to empower themselves against an all-powerful executive. I believe they're wrong. They believe they're right. You know, this is something that time will tell. We've seen in our own history that the parliamentary system can be distorted to give one person an extraordinary amount of power. That the prime ministerial system run by Mr. Modi, that prime ministerial system of Mr. Modi's, it seems to me, is far more autocratic than the presidential system of any theoretical leader that India might produce, because that president will also be balanced by strong independent chief executives in the states, in the cities, and the villages. But it's a larger conversation we need to have. I believe this exercise in discussing pros and cons is healthy and useful, but I will concede at the very end of it that the kinds of reform that Tarunabh is talking about within the existing ambit of the parliamentary system may have a slightly better chance of being actually adopted or voted by the government, but only if the government is filled with people of a broad-minded democratic vision who want to see that happening, rather than actually wanting to see, as the present government does, more power entrenched and consolidated in the hands of an omniscient and omnipotent prime minister. Thank you both for a very engaging discussion. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor. And I'd just like to announce to everyone that there is going to be a small moderated discussion after this. And there are some very interesting questions that have come to us. We may not be able to do justice to all of them, but I think I'd like to pose one question of my own, sort of cheating as a moderator here. But to borrow the house analogy, from this conversation, it seems that the problem may not be so much of the house, but the people who make up the house. And are we posing design solutions for what is an ethos problem? And I'd like to hear what all three of you ideally want to say about this, but if any of you want to take this up first.
Can I answer? Unfortunately, as I mentioned, I have another commitment at 6 o'clock and we'll have to leave this without participating in the rest of the discussion. I just wanted to say very simply that we have to look at India as she is. We have to look at our country with its own realities. We have to look at the people who are operating the system we have. We're not talking about an ideal theoretical model of a parliamentary system, nor am I advocating an ideal theoretical model of a presidential system. If the American one is flawed, it's because Americans are the way they are. If any Indian model is flawed, it will be because Indians are the way they are. And so you're quite right. The flaw may not be with a theory of a parliamentary model, And certainly it works very well in Britain, I might add, which is the right place it's suited for. It doesn't work here because we are Indians, or as we like to say, we are like this only. And the way we are, we have operated the system in the way in which we've done it. And the result, therefore, is that we have a system which very, very unfortunately has let us down time after time and seems to be in the process of letting us down by enabling what Jayaprakash Narayan famously called a plebiscitary dictatorship. Electing, as he put it, we are all a bunch of sheep electing the shepherd who's going to be waving a stick at us for the next 5 years. And that seems to be what we've already been witnessing unfold before us, particularly, I would say, in the 6th year of the 6 years of this particular government. And as lawyers, all of you know precisely what I'm referring to, the emergence of what has been described as an executive court, the emergence of a rubber stamp legislature, the hollowing out of various institutions that were set up by Parliament in theory to be independent, and the stifling of more and more independent voices, democratic voices, and the narrowing and shrinking space for dissent. So given all of this, seeing how the parliamentary system has been essentially made to work in this manner, you will forgive my inability to praise any theoretical model and say the problem is not the system, it's the people who work it. The people are the people we have. These are our people. These are the people we have elected. These are the people we will elect. Let's put them in a system where they can do less harm, in my view, to these constitutional values and principles. With those words, I will leave you all. I wish you a wonderful rest of the discussion and many, many thanks.
Thank you.
So I'll continue, pick up the thread. I completely agree with Dr. Tharoor that no political model is worth the paper it's written on unless it can actually work on in practice, right? Politics is you know, as President Clinton famously said, the art of the possible. So theoretical models are completely pointless in a political debate. Culture matters, political culture matters, and institutional design also matters. These are factors. So does chance, by the way, right? Who could have predicted the pandemic? So the best we can do is take our political realities as they exist and come up with designs that we think will work in, you know, nobody here, none of the speakers here, whether it's Mr. Dhamija or Dr. Tharoor or myself, disagree on the goals we want, right? Which is a flourishing, effective democracy. So the only question is how to get there. The one amendment I will make to Dr. Tharoor's reply is this, that institutional design can also shape culture in certain ways. So, and this is mainly in the electoral system. So when I talked about alternative vote models, it rewards parties who are not polarizing, and that will shape culture, right? So you can change culture by basically incentivizing good behavior and punishing bad behavior. But other than that, you know, good design is the best we can do. But that will no amount of good design will save a democracy, and sometimes democracies survive even terribly bad designs.
Mr. Dhamija, I think you're on mute, sir. Sir, you're on mute, sir. I'm so sorry, you're on mute, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Sorry about that. I have a slightly different view on this. I don't think it's a chicken or egg problem. I think something comes first. And I think it's the system that comes first. With a good system, you can build a good society. I think with a good system, you can build good leaders, good politicians, and of course, you can build fairness in society and good character in society, and so on and so forth. So if we enter into this debate that, like Shashi said, that we're like this only, then what we are saying is that we are not capable of building a better system or running it in a better way, which I think is a wrong attitude to take. We should strive to have the best system in the world. And we have a very good example, and we should follow it. And that system has worked for 233 years. There's a lot that we can learn from. And by adopting that system, I believe that we can build a better society, better culture, better character, and better Indians, better political leaders.
Thank you, sir. We have another interesting question from the audience about how the presidential system that we're talking about would work in the multi-party system that we have in India, given this whole US tradition of a two-party system. Perhaps Mr. Dhamija would want to lead with that?
Sure. There is a misconception about the US party system. The US party system is not a two-party system, is not a prerequisite for the US presidential system. The US two-party system is an outcome, is a result of the US presidential system. The way it works, and I touched upon that in my opening remarks, is that you have local regional parties. And in the history of the United States, there have been many of those local regional parties, as well as large national parties. And there are some other than the main parties, the Democratic and the Republican. So what happens is in that system, because the elections are held locally, because the governments are run locally, the regional small local parties can flourish locally. But when it comes to the national US presidential election, that is what really does the magic, because it allows it actually compels the small regional parties to come together on centrist mainstream political platforms. And this is what has given rise to these two Democratic and Republican parties. One has been conservative throughout history, and one has been liberal. And that fight is still going on. One believes in more government role and more spending, and the other believes in limited government and less spending. And that is the basic difference and the fundamental reason why those two parties exist. So to answer your question, if we adopt the US system in India, I think the parties will flourish on the local level, and there will still be multiple parties on the local level. But when it comes to the national parties, we would also move toward a two-party polity. And I think this will be beneficial in many ways, because in the end, large national issues need to come down to yes-no decisions, whether we are going to move in this direction or not move in this direction. And the two-party system helps it. Right now, we don't have a direction because every party is kind of the same, and they're just looking for power. So if we move toward a two-party system, I think that will change the political culture of the country.
Srishti, can I just add to that? I don't. So this is one issue on which I do disagree with Mr. Dhamija, and perhaps also useful to think about it in terms of ground realities, because Dr. Tharoor pointed out, India is what hum aise hi hain. So the duopoly in the US, and there's a fantastic paper by Sam Zakharov and Rick Pildes in the late 1990s. Where they talk about how the two-party system in the US is actually preserved as a duopoly by very strong cartelization by the two parties in the US, which use the might of the state and legal powers and financial laws to prevent the emergence of third parties. And I don't think that the two-party system will emerge in India because it adopts a presidential system. Most other countries did not see the smaller parties shutting shop, but they will also fight national elections. And we have seen third-party candidates and independent candidates fight American elections. They will not win, but they will be spoilers. And what you will have are negotiations based on, so currently the Republican Party in the US is trying to encourage Kanye West to be on the ticket in the hope that he will cut Joe Biden's votes, right? So that is the kind of negotiations you will have in the system where third-party candidates are put up as spoilers. An alternative would be an even more expensive second runoff system, right? So if you want to do, in a multi-party system, if you want to do presidentialism fairly, you either adopt an alternative vote or you adopt the fence system of having a runoff, right? So you do the first round, the two people who get the most number of votes, then have a second round of election to decide who gets 50%. But in a multi-party system, no candidate is likely to get 50%. In India, we haven't seen a parliament, to the best of my knowledge, where the ruling party had over 50% of votes, and I don't think that's likely to happen in presidential elections either.
Okay, so thank you for that, Professor Khaitan. Another question I thought I'd want both of your views on is that when we are talking about I hear this phrase often when we're talking about the judiciary, but there's always this fear of the tyranny of the unelected. And an argument for the presidential system is often that, we don't want the executive to be constituted of electable people. We want meritorious and talented people coming in. What do you think would happen in this system where you have an executive peopled by meritorious people brought in by this president? Can that have any dangers in terms of respecting people's will, or can that have any problems? Do you anticipate any problems with that? Either of you can take this question first.
After you, Mr. Dhamija. Okay, I can go.
Well, go ahead.
Well, so unlike Dr. Tharoor, I like politicians, and perhaps this is not a popular position to adopt anywhere in the world today, right? We all are living in a culture which loves criticizing politicians. Sab chor hain, sab badmash hain. They're all crooks, right? That's lazy journalism, and that's bad for democracy. It's bad for democracy because it's precisely that attitude that allows outside radicals to come and take over a system by saying, I will drain the swamp, I will clean up the system. So what is it to like about politicians, you ask? Unlike judges, politicians are the only tribe in public life who have to consistently and regularly meet people who oppose them and who oppose them vehemently. Judges belong to a very narrow social strata, and they very rarely meet people who are unlike them. Their worldview, and this applies to all democratic politicians, whatever their party, right? They have to deal with people who disagree with them, and that brings in a sensibility that there is a proper place for judges in democracy. Absolutely, judiciary has to be independent, and judiciary has to check unconstitutional power when badly exercised. But the Indian Supreme Court is not a model, and neither is the American Supreme Court, by the way, which is an entirely partisan judiciary that votes like a legislature rather than acts like a court. So I think the issue is very complicated, the issue that you have raised. But I think this lazy journalistic attitude that we have, that politics mein sab nange hain, it's a dirty thing, is extremely dangerous for democracy, and we have to stop thinking like that.
Well, let me ask a clarification first. Srishti, did you mean just the judiciary, or did you mean officials, all executive officials?
Yeah, so I meant that if we shift to a presidential system where your executive is people with those who have quote unquote talent and not those who have, say, won elections and come in.
So it's not just the judiciary?
No, it's not just the judiciary.
Right. Well, the first thing to understand there is that the US executive, the cabinet, does not work like the cabinet in our system. It only has executive powers. It cannot make laws, as you probably know. So if you bring in talent, and if you fear that they are not people's representatives, they're not elected officials, they are people, say, from the industry. They are probably friends of the president in a lot of cases. That will they pay attention to the general will of the people? But because they do not make laws, and because their powers are limited, and because they are not appointed just by the president alone, they are jointly appointed. Most senior cabinet officials are appointed both by the president and the Senate. And I'm sure you have all seen the grueling public hearings that they have to go through before they're selected. Those fears are minimized. They cannot do much harm because they have two political masters. They don't just report to the president, they also report to Congress. Now, as far as the judiciary is concerned, Dr. Khaitan made a comment that they vote like a legislature. The facts don't bear that out, even in most recent cases. Actually, there is a lot of discussion in the United States how some of the conservative judges are voting against Trump and his views, and people are shocked. But I believe that that is the case throughout history. The judges, after all, are judges. They are professionally trained and they are professionals. All the politicization that happens in the judiciary in the US system is in the process of their selection. And that is highly publicized and gives the impression that they are really politicians. They're not, they're actually still judges. So I'm not so fearful about the either the executive officials appointed in the cabinet or the judges appointed in that system because of that reason.
So I was going to end with a question, but I just feel like I should let both of you end with your thoughts on the way forward. And that's just going to be the last segment of this moderated discussion. Anything that you want to share with us, Mr. Dhamija, Professor Khaitan?
Okay. Well, all I want to say is that we all know in our hearts that our current system is broken. We are a great people, but we are not building a great nation under this system. And we must be brave and bold and not insecure or prejudiced. We should take another fresh look at the presidential system. And I think with its help, we can build the India of all our dreams. So I would really urge people to vote for the motion that we should adopt the presidential system.
I would suggest that one marker of democratic success is best survival against the odds that India faces. It's remarkable heterogeneity. It's extreme difficulties and problems. So yes, the system is broken, but let's not lose sight of the fact that the system has survived. And I believe that the system has survived as a democracy, flawed and fragile, albeit maybe, because of the parliamentary system. So let's try to improve it and remove its defects and vote against the motion.
Thank you. Thanks to both Mr. Dhamija and Professor Khaitan for this wonderful moderated discussion. I'd like to thank all our speakers, Dr. Tharoor as well. It's been absolutely enriching to hear both of you. I'm sure our audience has enjoyed it. So thank you for making time and being here. I'd like to thank our audience as well for listening to this debate. And I really feel like these conversations are very important to find solutions to the problems of our system. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank our media partners, LiveLaw, whose team has taken painstaking efforts to put this together. And if I have missed anyone, my apologies. It's just my poor memory, but thank you, everyone.